Yeah, let's start. So what is the secret to success? Why do all successful people have to wake up at 4 a.m.? Do all college dropouts become millionaires? Was music better in the old days? Hi, my name is Jan, and I'm an Erlang developer at Erlang Solutions. And in today's presentation, I would like to explain and talk about the survivor bias, explain basically what it is, where we can find it, and what can we do about it. But let me first rewind a little bit and let me tell you my favorite story in all of psychology. So during the Second World War, US military was having this problem. They were puzzled by this problem of how to improve the survivability of aircrafts, meaning they wanted to minimize the bomber losses to the enemy fire. So back in the day, it was sometimes like a coin flip, whether an aircraft would come back from a mission or not. And actually, they were not so keen about this let it crash idea, especially when it came to real aircrafts with real people on board. So they needed an answer for that. Yeah. So if you want to improve the survivability of your aircraft, who are you gonna call? I'm not sure who are you thinking about calling, but the person who you should be calling was Abraham Wald. Abraham Wald was a Hungarian Jewish mathematician and actually one of the best statisticians of his time. Before war, actually, he and his family were persecuted for being Jewish. And in 1938, he immigrated to the US. Sadly, most of his family didn't make it, didn't immigrate, and died in concentration camps. Once Walt came to New York, he joined a group of mathematical soldiers called the Statistical Research Group. I have to admit, the name may be not the most fortunate. Statistical Avengers or the League of Mathematical Justice would be much better fit, but that's how they are naming the official departments. Walt was working on numerous projects related to statistical sampling, and he helped to develop new tools that could help make sense of the modern battlefield that got really complicated with all the new technology that was introduced. With technology like radar, submarines, sonar, and rockets, it was really hard to understand what is going on. And there was no one person that could understand it all. So the military commanders wanted mathematicians and statisticians to help them understand and intake all the variables from the battlefield, process it, and help them to make more informed decisions. They wanted to get some more mathematical insight that could possibly shift the tide of war. One of the things that Walt came up with was the idea of creating and distributing sampling cards of aircraft. And they were distributed among all the bomber crews. And whenever a plane was coming for landing, the crew was to examine the aircraft, see where it was hit and where the new damage was introduced in that plane. And as more and more results came in, the cards look somewhat like this. And by looking at these, we could tell where the planes were hit the most, which is right at the very center, by the edges of the wings, and by the tail. And as they were gathering more and more of these results, military commanders thought that they could start and take action on it quickly. So they wanted to reinforce the plane, but actually they couldn't reinforce the whole plane. So the idea was that the tank with wings wouldn't take off. So instead of shielding the whole plane, they wanted to prioritize those few places with the most hits. And they wanted to put additional armor in those places that we could see here. So if Sherlock Holmes were to see this data analysis, I think he would say something along the lines of, you see, but you don't observe. And that's what basically they did. They saw the data, but they didn't quite understood it, yeah? And that's what basically Walt told them. He stopped them immediately before making this huge and expensive mistake. He explained to them that the planes that they sampled came back to the base, meaning that they flew out on a mission, they were coming back, they were hit by enemy fire, but those hits, those bullets, didn't prohibit them from coming back to the base. What they actually should be worried about are the areas without the hits, because these planes are missing. Like whole data sets that they collected was skewed towards the survivors. And they should focus on the planes that didn't make it, on the planes that crashed, and actually put the armor where we don't see any bullet holes. Because the assumption was that these are the places where those planes have holes, the planes that didn't return. That's what they did. It was the right decision, and it actually helped to influence the outcome of war. And it's quite a common misconception that if we want to achieve success, we should focus on what's successful. We love this idea about reading about our idols, listening to podcasts, reading biographies, watching interviews, and trying to sneak in, get this, one secret, one insight that will allow us to replicate their success. And people share what they think allowed them to become so successful. But there's a problem with that because they actually don't share all the possible variables that allow them to end up where they are. So we sometimes look at those successful people, we look at those survivors of the way to success, and we ask them questions, yeah, but it's possible that maybe they were not hit in the places that would prohibit them from becoming successful. Places that only people that failed would tell us about. And it seems that there is a lot of knowledge and insight in failures, insight and knowledge that we are omitting. And just a quick side note, there are those cool events being organized about the globe. They are called fuck up nights. These are events where the premise is that people go on stage and tell us a story about their fuck up. So sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's sad, but it's always a great learning experience. And it's against shaming people for their failure and actually trying to collectively learn from that. And I think that's real value. And I'm sure that it's happening also in your town. So if possible, join those meetings or present if you wish. So while it's hard to find books and movies on those hundreds of people that drop out from college to create the next Facebook, next Microsoft, it's sometimes important to remember that when we try to recreate someone else's success, it won't necessarily translate to the same result, yeah? So with all those people that tried to start the next Facebook and failed, the problem may be, as we can see it in these comics, nobody's counting them. They are omitted, they are removed from view, and we only focus on the small group of people that succeeded. So it seems that there is some kind of issue with how we take advice, how we sample our data, and even if we have a second world war with the stakes of the whole globe are at stake, and people tend to make biased decisions based on this survivability bias, like, is it a more common phenomenon? Is it occurring also in other areas of our life? The answer is yes, and it's actually more common than we would imagine or we would like it to be. For most of human history, our survival was primarily dependent on our ability to make quick decisions when we actually don't have time to sit down and think about all possible solutions for a problem. So we are naturally programmed with certain mental shortcuts that allow us to make quick decisions over and over again based on our past experiences. And they are very good for us because we often need to make quick decisions, but they also can lead to things like cognitive bias, survivorship bias, stereotypes, and prejudice. These biases can lead to some kind of logical error or some subconscious errors, and then impact our decision-making process. So what is survivorship bias? It's a kind of logical error where we think when we assume that success will tell us everything about the process or event, and we focus only on the survivors when we evaluate the outcome. And after the process is finished, the non-survivors are often forgotten or removed from view. Like with the example of Abraham Wold, the planes that crashed and didn't make it back to the base were removed from view. We forgot about them. And as Nassim Taleb said it nicely in his book, data obscured by survivorship bias is silent evidence. And he had another great quote that the graveyard of failed restaurants is very silent. It is like when we go to a city center or main square, when we go out there and we see all those restaurants that are successful and like fully packed with people, we tend to think that this business must be really easy. You could see, so many restaurants with so many people in it. But what we are doing, we are actually forgetting about all the restaurants that failed because they are very silent, because the graveyard of failed restaurants is very silent. So what to do? What can we do about that? So trying actually to, like the very first step to overcome these biases is trying to be aware of them, to learn about them. And this awareness is the key in our battle. So being aware of those biases enables us to get influence over them and try to counter what they are doing to our brain. So we need to realize that it's inside us all, and to a large extent, we cannot avoid it. But what can we do is to learn about it and try to manage that. So let's take a product, a software product or an application. We want to get some feedback from our most loyal customers, and we need to know how can we improve our product so that we can make it even better. And this can be seen as the example with the airplanes, actually, when we have the survivors, so our loyal customers, and then we may end up with adding more shielding at the edges of our wings, which may be important, but maybe if we ask ourselves, who are the non-survivors in this situation? So where are the people that wanted to use our product but went to the competition? What shot them along the way to our base? And if we answer this question, we may get some really important insight. And then we could ask ourselves on where to put this additional armor so that we make it easier for our customers to get in. One of the areas where survivorship bias may creep in on us is testing. So be it, testing only for success, testing only for happy paths. These are quite common and it's well known to avoid. We should use multiple hypotheses that go against our pre-existing notions. And this way we try to have a broader perspective. We can use some frameworks, some tools that could assist us in doing so. But the survivorship bias might also creep in some other places. Like, for example, let's imagine that we are selecting the data set for our tests. And let's ask ourselves whether we're not selecting data only from the survivors, yeah? So next time you're getting data for tests, be creative, challenge your data and try for it to be as wide as possible. Getting other perspective may also really help, asking someone to challenge the data for you, getting, coded reviews, peer reviews, or brainstorming sessions, yeah? So it's really important, actually, why we have those methodologies in our work, because they help us to broaden the perspective and actually sometimes get rid of those biases. Another area where we should be on the lookout for the survivorship bias is monitoring, which is like keeping an eye on the things we assume or know can go wrong. But this is already imposing some kind of our internal biases onto the data, yeah? So we should be looking at the monitoring dashboard and ask ourselves, what are the survivors? So when we are presenting our data, we often create some kind of success criteria, and wherever data is getting there, these are the survivors, and whatever is missed, these are the non-survivors, yeah? And sometimes some answers can be hidden there. So let's imagine a situation that we look at our monitoring dashboard and we have this one favorite metric of response time of our server. And what we are trying to do is to minimize it to a millisecond. And for that, we assume that our customers will be happy and the product will be great. But what may be happening actually is that some customers have problem even establishing a session to our server, be it other part of the application not working well, infrastructure or networking error. Our single metric will not tell us about it, yeah? So things we can do, we can try, to think about how to monitor and test our applications end to end. Really think about where each end is and try to get as close to it as possible. Observability are ways and tools that could help us to find the unexpected and then for us to dig in and try to explain why it happened. It's not unusual to see large data volumes in observability when we are pushing terabytes of data per day. Metric aggregation is efficient, but it still requires tags, categories, infrastructure, which is underlying, and it increasing the cardinality of our data. Yeah, so we are flooded with information. When it comes to distributed traces, for each request, we may creating multiple spans. So let's imagine we have hundreds of requests for which we would have thousands of spans. And sometimes when we were investigating failure or some kind of outlier in our system, what we want to do is actually investigate those spans. So we are faced with this signal to noise problem, but it's sometimes hard to tell what is the signal and what is noise, because we don't know what we don't know. And when we impose some kind of filter onto this data, we remove some data, some of it, yeah? So sometimes less data is just that, it's just less data and less information. For distributed tracing, what we can do, we can use sampling. So for example, sample every 5 or 10% of data randomly, and let's hope that our outliers or failures will be represented in that data. Yeah? Sometimes it's just not possible to take all this whole influx of information and manage it properly. But it's important for us to remember that whenever we filter our data in any way, we are reducing the data set, and we may be imposing our own biases onto it. So what to do? So we, like the Air Force engineers, we need to armor our vulnerabilities. There are many tools and frameworks that we can use, but it's the most important thing that we can do is actually to change our perspective. Remember that we are all biased and we actually cannot avoid it to a large extent. However, what we can do is learn about it, and that's actually the first step to overcoming those biases. We can use practices like pair programming, brainstorming, code reviews, peer reviews, and this can help us, broaden our horizon. Once we know about the survivorship bias, it seems reasonable and fairly simple, but actually, just taking a pause, looking at your monitoring dashboard, test or data set, and simply asking yourself if you are not looking at the survivors is surprisingly powerful. So when we are working on vulnerable points of our application or system, let's try not to put additional armor at the edges of the wings. And the key message that I would like you to leave with is that next time when you're testing or monitoring your application, please remember about survivorship bias. Remember about this picture, remember about this guy and what it represents. Please be aware that this bias exists and it's actually incredibly easy to fall into. Ask yourself whenever you're looking at your data or monitoring tool, if you're looking only at the survivors, and how can you expand your horizon so that you can keep your system flying. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening. I think maybe we could go to Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, John. This is awesome. This is an extremely valuable reminder, and seeing your code sort of as a crime scene where you're the detective investigating it. So let's see if we have time for one question, since we're running out of time. Very inspiring. So we have a question here. I don't know who asked it. Is bias the downside of learning from experience? So I'll read out the questions as we're
yeah, I think it's quite the opposite. Yeah. So we can learn from the experiences, and actually some biases, even some stereotypes are not all bad. Yeah. So I would not look at it as only something negative, but it's a coin with two sides. And us learning about it and seeing the two sides of it can be very powerful and allows us to use the strengths and contradict the weak points.